We're going to use this photo we worked on in a previous lesson to demonstrate how it would look if we used smart filters instead of what we did. If you remember, as we were creating this, we had to create two different intermediate layers for our third-party plugins to use, and then delete them later to come up with this layer structure. But also, if we wanted to make a change, let's say on the effects that we had placed on the color effects layer, we would have to delete this layer since the effects are really baked in, the adjustments are baked in, and then recreate them somehow. So what Smart Objects allow you to do is to be able to go back into that third-party software, make the adjustments without recreating any layer. However, and you knew there was going to be a however, nothing in life is free. What the downside is, and you'll see it in this demonstration, is when I was working with that little fake triangles and everything went pretty fast. But it was a very small file. This is a 30 megapixel file from my Canon, and so you'll see that it takes longer. The other thing is when you're working with third-party filters, it's going to constantly go back to that filter to get anything done, and you'll see examples of that also. So first thing is, let's get rid of these layers here, and then let's take these two layers and convert to Smart Object. Okay, and you can see right away that it's taken a little longer to do something. So now we've got a smart object here. Okay, if you remember, we used the Nik tools and we used On1. So let's start with the Nik tools. We'll go up to Filter, Nik Tools, Color Efex Pro. And it will come up normally copying the photo over to its software. Now it notes that it's a smart object, so it will operate as a smart filter. Here is the tonal contrast, which is what I use to soften the background. Now if you remember, we don't want the softening on the face, so we're going to take a negative control point here and take that effect off of the head of the tortoise. We'll add that filter. We're going to do a detail extractor on here, which gets some detail into the face of the tortoise. We're going to reduce that effect a bit, and we're going to take a plus control point so that it takes off that hyper detail off the rest of the photo. Like that. Add the filter, and then the final thing we did is we did a vignette using the darken and lighten center function. We're going to place the center. Let's darken the border a little more and add that filter and say OK. So it's going to save the image as layer in Photoshop, and this time it is going to be a smart layer when it gets done doing its thing. Again, I didn't edit out any of the timings here, so you could see what working with smart filters and smart objects does in a real world situation. Okay, so you can see that it created on Smart Filter, and we have one under here, Color Efex Pro 4. Now you notice when I was working in the color effects, I took advantage of the control points to target the adjustments. And I'm going to recommend when you're working with smart filters that you use the third-party plugins features for targeting adjustments and not masks, and I'll tell you why in a second. You'll see it better in a moment. So what we also did a Viveza to lighten up the face of the tortoise. So let's go back to filters, Nik Collection, Viveza. Alright, we'll hit F to make it bigger, and I'm going to add a control point, and let's brighten that face a bit, and we'll say OK. And the last thing that we wanted to do is we used On1 to add dynamic contrast to the face of the tortoise. So we go to On1, bring up the effects module. So what we did last time is when we applied the dynamic contrast to the tortoise head, we applied it to the entire photo in On1, and then when we got to Photoshop, we masked out the parts we didn't want with that effect on it. This time we're going to do it differently. We're going to actually use the masking tool in On1, and when we get back to Photoshop, I'll show you the reason why. So let's select Natural, which is the preset that I like to use, and let's do the masking. Again, I'm not going to talk about the details. I'll just basically say we'll invert the mask so we take off most of the effect. I will select the masking tool, and I want to paint in the effect. So I will start painting here. Alright, so we can get that more detail in the head of the tortoise. Let me check how my mask looks. Okay, finish fixing that. As you can see, the concepts are the same between Photoshop and On1, but it's implemented a bit different, which is why I mentioned you have to learn the intricacies of the plugins that you use. So we're going to go down here and say Done. And On1 is going to be rendering the image and communicating back with Photoshop by including this as a smart filter. You can see things take a bit longer. So right here we have had that effect added. Now, why did I do the masking in On1 this time? And here's the reason. When you implement a smart filter, you only get one mask. You can see this mask here for all the effects that you want. Okay. So what I did is use Nik's control point to target the effect, and I used On1's masking to target the effect. So when it came back here, I'm not even going to worry about the mask. Otherwise, when I did masking, I would have all these effects to deal with, and you couldn't do that on one mask. There is a real tricky way to get around that. It's beyond the scope of this lesson, and it has to do with indented multiple masks. Again, it's pretty complicated, so I'm not going to talk about that. The easiest thing to do is really use the features of your third-party tools. Okay, so what did we gain by doing all this? Well, the main thing that we gained is we're able to go back into any of these filters and readjust. So let's go back into our Color Efex Pro, and we can do that by double-clicking on its name right here. Now what it's telling us here, are there other filters involved in our Smart Filter? And when you go back, and they're stacked on top of it, so when I go back into Color Efex Pro, I'm not going to be able to see the effect of ON1 and see the effect of Viveza that's stacked above it, which is fine for our purposes. So it's loading Color Efex Pro back in, and what we should see when it comes up is all the filters I had used and the settings that I had used, such as darkening the border luminosity here. So let's say I wanted to rearrange this a little bit, get this closer to the eye, and take the center size down a bit so it's darker, and bring the center luminosity up so it's a little lighter on the face, and say OK. So there is the great thing about a Smart Filter. You can go back in and readjust any part of your layers without having to delete and recreate. The negative side is the time it takes to do these round trips. It's extra because the computer's doing extra processing. So if you might have an underpowered Mac or PC, and you can see right here what it's doing, it's going to re-render all these other filters. And so it's going to take longer to get back. You see, it's bringing up ON1 RAW photo again to put the dynamic contrast back. It's going to do the same thing with Viveza. And in fact, if you click on the visibility of each little smart feature, I'll show you that in a second, it will do the same thing for that particular filter. So you will have to decide if the ability to go back in to Smart Filter and readjust in the original program is worth the time it takes in your workflow. And that's going to depend on the computer that you have at home. You know, the more memory, the faster graphics card, the faster your CPU is, the better off you'll be. Okay, that's it for Smart Filters, and that is the end of part 3 of our Targeted Adjustments class.